Hello, I'm Sir Jackros, and welcome to the deck portion of the Brawl Death based on Vraska Swarm's Eminence, as I've named it, A Touch of Death. Now, first things first, the audio should be a lot better this time round. I apologise for it again in the video with the gameplay. I at first thought that it was an issue with the recording software since I was using the built-in stuff as opposed to OBS as I usually would. However, my initial footage for this also wasn't the best, so I have no idea what was going on with my mic that day, but it seems to have sorted itself out, so hopefully it'll all sound smooth and everything will be fine. So, let's start out with the deck itself and what's currently in there. So, first things first, we have a decent selection of Death Touchers. We also have Leyline Prowler in this pile, which is just because I've sorted them for convenience with what they're meant to be doing. Since Death Touchers make up the brunt of our deck, the majority of them do have Death Touch. Knight of the Ebon Legion technically doesn't, but he can pump himself to give it to himself, and so is generally a good enough beater for the 1 mana range to make it worthwhile. And if I've not got anything worth playing on turn 3, he can still get a punch in, he can start growing, and then late game, when I've got the spare mana, he can have Death Touch. If he gets blocked and I don't need to give him Death Touch, no need to give him Death Touch. But outside of that, it's pretty straightforward. Foulmire Knight's Profane Insight allows you to draw an extra card if you get it later on, otherwise it's still a 1/1 for 1, which makes it better than Hired Poisoner, and Sedge Scorpion. However, it's still generally better to have the cheaper Death Touchers down, so I think I only cut... in fact, did I even cut? No, I don't think I even cut, because Hired Poisoner is the one that I would cut, if any, from the 1 mana slot. But I decided against it, because they're better to have the 1 drops down in this deck than the 2/2s, since 2/2s for 3... they end up getting played, they get blocked, they die, the thing that's blocking them dies. People are a lot more willing to block them than a 1/1, and it's coming out a lot later, so it's a lot less likely to get some free hits in. So we then have some mana acceleration, not all that much in the grand scheme of things. We've got Paradise Druid, Hexproof is useful, also plays in with the Gruesome Menagerie, since there's only the 1 2-mana Death Toucher, which is Orzhov Enforcer. So Paradise Druid ended up coming in to try and make Gruesome Menagerie more worthwhile. Arcane Signet, pretty good if you're playing anything that pretty much anything that's Brawl. Heck, even in Commander, it's worth running. Leyline Prowler is in here rather than the Death Touch pile, because whilst it is a Death Toucher, it's also mana acceleration, and it can fulfill both roles very nicely. It's a good attacker, the lifelink can be relevant, it's got a decent body, and the mana ramp is key at times. And then Zhang Yangyu, whose name I probably butchered, but he can put counters on things, those things can tap for mana, and Vraska, if they hit things, puts counters on them. So, in conjunction with each other, they should theoretically be able to provide me with a lot more ramp to get down things like the Great Henge, which sometimes doesn't have that great of a cost reduction in this deck. So, next up, we've got the current Recursion lineup. Witch's Cottage is a land. I do have slightly more forests than swamps in here, but we've got enough fixing to make it work for the most part. I do have the Evolving Wilds and the Fabled Passage and Death Sprout, so by the end of the game it usually is able to get a recursion, and it's not the worst if not. Order of Midnight is probably one that I'd cut alongside Gruesome Menagerie when we get to that, because once again this is in here because it's a 2-mana creature that can return a creature from my graveyard to my hand. It's decent, it's able to provide an aggressive body, but the body itself doesn't have Death Touch. It returns a single creature, which sometimes is a little bit inefficient, but it can still then produce the body afterwards, which could arguably make it better than some of the other 1 mana or return 1 thing cards. Find Finality gives us a board wipe, gives us additional counters on something if we need them, or well, or we return 2 things from our graveyard to our hand. 2 creatures, pretty decent, especially since these cheaper Death Touchers will trade quite frequently, and then for 2 mana to be able to get them back and almost immediately replay them, we can keep up the pressure alongside with Vraska. Find Broker is able to return a permanent, so it's able to get back all of the creatures and also the Planeswalkers, so that's useful, and also the Great Henge, if that were to get destroyed, or one of our other enchantments that we've got. And then Gruesome Menagerie. Main reason why this card's still in the deck is I run it in my Oathbreaker version of Vraska Swarm's Eminence, and it does some really good work there. In this deck, I'm not quite as convinced because the aforementioned lack of 2 mana Death Touchers and other decent 2 mana things to fill that slot with without taking up too much space of the deck does bring it down, since we're then less likely to actually get the full value from it. And I think I'd rather put in one of the other return creature cards, or I'll get to them when we get to the cards not currently in the deck. But this is one that I'd probably cut in the grand scheme of things for some other options. But may work if I'm able to get some more decent 2-drops in the coming sets to fill up that slot. So next up we have our removal. So Status Statue provides triple duty effectively. It allows us to get 1 extra damage and toughness if necessary. If someone is blocking for exacts, then it can save a creature. We have some creatures that don't have Death Touch. It can give them Death Touch for the turn if they're not expecting it, because, I mean, why would I have a card to give things Death Touch if most of my things have Death Touch? But the main use for this card is the statue side, so being able to remove a creature, artifact, or enchantment is pretty decent, gives a lot of versatility to it, and the status can, in some instances, be relevant, but if not, it's still a solid removal card. Rabid Bite. Death Touch. Death Touch works really well with cards that deal damage, and because it's one-sided, as opposed to fights, my weak Death Touchers don't die. So it can essentially be 3 mana, so, drop Sedge Scorpion, play Rabid Bite, something's just been killed. Doesn't matter how big it is, so long as it's not got indestructible. Assassin's Trophy is able to answer any permanent. Does give the opponent a land, but for 2 mana, it's a decent answer to anything, and sometimes is necessary, and also is able to answer lands if someone's playing, say, Field of the Dead. Murderous Rider, once again, Planeswalkers, an area that I found some issues with some of my games, since the Vraska's tokens are able to insta-kill Planeswalkers if they make contact, but they don't always make contact, and because I can only make 2 at a time, if I'm playing against someone with heavy control elements, large number of creatures, it can sometimes get a little bit overwhelming to answer all of them. So Murderous Rider is a good answer to that, is able to provide a body afterwards, and if it dies it goes back into the deck, where I can essentially, with if I get one of my Evolving Wilds or one of my other cards like Death Sprout, which gets me to search my library, it can get shuffled in, and I might be able to get more than one use out of it. Vraska Golgari Queen. The sack outlet allows me to get rid of Vraska Swarm's Eminence if my opponent's not killing it, because I've run out of Death Touches on the board, and I can't then replay it to get more Death Touches out. It's also able to deal with most things that are on the cheap side, so it can clear out some of the weaker creatures that opponents are more likely to want to trade my Death Touches with, so that they have to block with more threatening creatures. And then finally, the -9 will be very impactful, because once we enable the trample, Death Touch, only needing to deal 1 damage to kill something, makes it really difficult for them to effectively stop. Despero, is probably the weakest removal card in this deck, since it only hits creatures, but it does get a land, so it technically can also fit in here. But that's the main reason I think it's worth running, is it's able to remove a creature, pretty decent. It's able to get me a land, pretty decent. 4 mana could be replaced with something else if something better comes along, but for now, it's serving me well. And Casualties of War is the big one. This is so much fun if you're able to get all of those modes, which I have done, and it was glorious. Most of the time you're only going to hit 2, maybe 3 things, but even then, it's still just great value, and in a singleton format, the opponent will really feel it when you start blowing up everything. So, here we have sort of our enabler cards. So we have our 3 main trample enablers with Vizier, Arcbow Ranger. It's able to put counters on things, which once again works well with Vraska, and getting counters on things already. The one-sided fight is as a minus, also really useful with the Death Touchers, so it felt like a worthwhile inclusion. Trollbred Guardian gives trample only to things with +1/+1 counters, so it's not quite as good as Aggressive Mammoth in that regard, but I want to have as many versions of his effects as possible available to me so that I'm more likely to draw them, and most of my Death Touchers are 1/1s, so they really need to have counters on before they're going to start getting too much value with trample anyway, so it's not too much of a loss. And then Aggressive Mammoth, which just gives everything trample. So there's that. And then we have Evolution Sage and Khan's Bastion as just some ways for continuous proliferation. I did consider some other proliferate effects. However, I think these two being able to be used repeatedly makes them the best options, even though they can sometimes be a little bit more underwhelming. It's like Khan's Bastion, I really have to have nothing else to do or a lot of mana available to me to get the proliferate, and sometimes drawing a land when I've got nothing to proliferate because Vraska's not hit the board yet or my Death Touchers have been cleared out a few times, it can be a bit painful. But it's a bit more effective in the long run, and with all of the creature recursion isn't always a bad thing. And then finally we have card draw and sorting. So Cryptic Caves, I've not got too many harsh costs. There are a few, but they're all at the high end. Arcbow Ranger is probably the strictest one, followed by Casualties of War and Golgari Finebroker, but the mana base hasn't been too much of a problem, and having just that one land, which sometimes may be dead, but other times it allows you to draw that one extra card you may need that can change the tide of the battle in the long run. But otherwise, it's decent enough. Once Upon a Time, if it's in your opening hand, it's free. So you can grab your land or one of the various creatures, which you'll usually be able to play straight after. So it's a good option for thinning out the deck, and allows us to basically play it in the place of a land. So I think we have 23 lands in this deck. Yeah, 23 lands. So have that in the place of a land, and it makes things consistent enough alongside the rest of our acceleration. Midnight Reaper, creatures die, draw cards, decent body, one of the few creatures that doesn't have Death Touch, but is a cheap enough effect to come down, and with the creature recursion can get back quite easily. Guardian Project really should just be an auto-include if you're playing green in a commander, or well, in any singleton format, since it's going to always draw me a card. Pretty much. I think like in standard at the moment, the only 2 cards that could be played that it doesn't draw a card from are Persistent Petitioners and 7 Dwarves. And if you're playing Persistent Petitioners, you don't have much of a need to splash for green. And if you're playing 7 Dwarves, you've only got 7 Dwarves. So it's not quite as consistent, but you're still going to get value out of it, for the most part. I mean, I guess if you're playing red-blue, copying effects and then... But yeah, it's a very niche circumstance in which Guardian Project is not a good option when you're playing in green in a singleton format. Multiplying Reclamation allows me to get some life gain, which can offset the downside from the Midnight Reaper, but also because it's focusing on when my creatures die, and since my creatures have Death Touch, and my opponents are going to eventually want to block them, and they'll probably trade in most instances, my creature's going to die a lot. My creatures die, gain life, draw a card, everything's good. And then finally, Great Henge. Life gain is a nice touch. It gives more mana acceleration. It can, yeah, once again, another card that can fit in here quite nicely. But it then draws me a card whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield, and on top of that, puts a +1/+1 counter on them. So Trollbred gets immediately enabled. My Death Touches are already bigger. Trample is now relevant again, and everything's just slightly bigger. So that's pretty much all I can ask for from a single card. And yes, I think most of the time I end up casting it for 7 mana, since the or so, 6 mana maybe, but even then it's still got such great impact on the following turns. And I think there have been some cases where I have got it down for cheaper, like when an Embodiment of Agnes comes down and is absolutely massive, because it's not just mana costs, it's the, or converted mana cost, it's the actual mana cost, which is brilliant, since this and this count differently. You've not just got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You actually get, so you're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, just, you can get such a big Embodiment of Agnes that it's kind of hilarious at times. It gets to the point where the Death Touch feels superfluous, and then you get an extra counter from the Great Henge. You get an extra counter if it makes contact with the enemy. So life's good if you're an Embodiment Agnes in the late game. Anyways, that's the main deck, and I will now look at the sideboard cards I've put in here for the moment, which are just cards that were either cut at some point, or I've considered and haven't made the cut yet because I think something else fills it better, or in some cases ones that I've just not tested yet that I think could be good. Although there are 2 that I've forgotten to add, so let's start with them. Band Together is another version of Rabid Bite. It's 1 extra mana, but does get instant speed and can target 2 creatures, which helps if the opponent has removal. They can, in response to Rabid Bite, kill the thing that you're targeting to deal the damage. Nothing's valid. Feels bad, you don't kill their thing. Band Together, being able to select 2, gives you some insurance policy. Being able to do it instant speed can allow you to do it during their turn before they have a chance to kill something of yours. But at 3 mana, it's a little bit on iffy, since I then have to have a creature to get the damage through, and we're in the range where we can start just straight up killing things with our more premium black-green removal. And then we have Aid the Fallen, which could also take the place of the Order of Midnight, since it's a 2 mana, return a creature to hand, but it can also return Planeswalkers. Main reason I overlooked it initially was I only had the 2 Planeswalkers in there. If I had another 2 Planeswalkers, so had the 4, it could potentially get more value with being able to return the creature and the Planeswalker, whilst still being good if I only get one of them. But it's a possibility. It's not in there. This one I've always got on the back of my mind, and does depend on what Planeswalkers are in the deck. So, Spark Harvest. going back to the problem I had with removing Planeswalkers, Spark Harvest is a good answer to that. At 1 mana, my creatures being cheap and being able to be recurred with my Recursion, not too bad to sacrifice one of them. And then in the late game, I can still, for 5 mana, get the kill on a creature or Planeswalker. But once again, in black-green, you have quite a bit of premium removal. There's quite a few other answers for Planeswalkers, and I thought it got a bit excessive. Mausoleum Secrets, some good deck thinning. It's able to get some cards from our deck into our hand, so it can technically then, like with the Once Upon a Time, be a second copy of a card we need as opposed to another card in the deck. Reason I'm a little bit iffy on it is because it's only creature cards in it, I do have to have the creatures hit the graveyard, and if I'm then fetching something, it needs to be really impactful. And because it's only black cards, it does limit out some of the better options on the green side, like Questing Beast. Pollenbright Druid is probably the best consideration for proliferation, and if there's a few more decent 2-mana creatures to make the Gruesome Menagerie more worthwhile, will definitely be one I put in, since it can either put a counter on itself, or in most cases will hopefully just proliferate the entire board and get a lot of value out of it that way. Noxious Groody is one of the 3 mana 2/2 Death Touchers, which just aren't quite good enough. So Noxious Groody, Crawl Stinger, and Pitiless Gorgon. They're nice for the Embodiment of Agonies, since they all have their different CMCs, but they're just not quite good enough. They're a bit too slow. They don't have enough impact on their own. The Elder Spell gives me a way to get rid of my Vraska Swarm's Eminence, once again if my opponent's not killing it. Or, alternatively, if they're playing a lot of Planeswalkers, I can wipe them out in one go, put all of the counters on Vraska, and get as many Planeswalkers as I destroy, I can get an additional Assassin token, which seems pretty decent to me. Only reason I've not really gotten this deck at the moment is because I've not actually got one. So that's one that I probably will try out at some point. It's going to be fun. Or it may just end up dead in a lot of situations if my opponents aren't playing enough Planeswalkers. Soul Salvage is 3 mana, return 2 creatures from graveyard to hand. It's another return effect. It's probably the worst of the ones that I've currently got available to me. That can return 2 things, since I'll get into the other 2 I'm considering. In fact, let's just do them now. So, Dead Revels. The Spectacle is really easy to enable with Death Touchers, so most of the time you're able to get 2 back for 2, which is pretty efficient. That one was in the deck, and I believe got cut for Order of Midnight for enabling the Gruesome Menagerie. So that may go back in its place. However, I think first of all I'm going to be trying out Once and Future, since this is an interesting one, since it returns cards as opposed to just creatures or permanents, which is what you normally get in the black and green varieties. Being able to return cards instead of permanents means that I can then get back the powerful impact cards, I can get back my removal, so yeah, I can get Casualties of War and cast that twice, which is going to be really satisfying. And if the Adamant is paid, both go to hand as opposed to just one and one on top of the library if you don't pay the Adamant. But it's also instant speed, so I get to do it during the opponent's turn and have my removal held up. Or even I can have removal in graveyard if I've got enough mana. I can Once and Future get back my removal, kill something. So I feel that it's got a lot more flexibility. That makes it worth that 1 extra mana over the Soul Salvage, and also the potential 2 mana more than Dead Revels. So that's one that I do really want to try out, and will try out at some point. Starev is another recursion option. It allows me to get a lot of recursion on a more frequent basis than some of the one-offs, but once again is one I don't have and didn't feel like spending a wildcard on, since might not make the cut in the long run. So I gave it a pass for now. Vizier of the Scorpion is in a similar spot to the other 3 mana Death Touchers, where this one gets to make 2 bodies with a total power of 2, but this does have some potential as being better, because once again, it's 2 bodies, so it can work better with going wide, but because of the fact that the Vizier gives the army Death Touch, as opposed to the army or Vizier having Death Touch on their own, is if one of them dies, the other one is worthless. It could, however, work better, and probably would be something I'd do in if I were to do a historic version of this deck. You could do a good zombie sub-theme, since you've got Liliana at the top end to be able to create zombie tokens, which Vizier would be able to give the Death Touch to. You have Death Baron, which also gives all of your zombies Death Touch. So I could see some potential there if you were to have a zombie sub-theme, but in the main deck at the moment, it's not really worth adding in its place. Feral Abomination is a 6 mana 5/5 Death Toucher, and will die to removal if they've got it, or will be tramp blocked to death constantly. So it's not worth the mana for the body, when ideally we want to get our cheaper things, which being able to recur allows us to play them out again, so when the opponents are blocking aggressively, we're getting more creatures out than them to get the push through, to get them to grow, whereas something this big is just begging to be killed or blocked for all eternity. It's never going to hit unless the board is absolutely clear, at which point I'd rather be going wide with smaller things that can then grow more effectively. Garrix is another way of giving trample with that emblem, and maybe something that I'll try again going in with Vraska Golgari Queen, since my initial issue when he was in the deck initially was I didn't have any way to kill the wolves. And without being able to kill the wolves, I don't get the emblem. Without getting the emblem, Garrix not as good as he could be. But he does still pump out a lot of bodies, he does get rid of a creature, he does draw a card, he still does a lot of good things there even without the emblem, so he's worthwhile, just was in that little bit of a questionable area when I had no sack outlets. And finally, Plain White Celebration. It's able to return cards from graveyard to my hand, is able to proliferate. Those are both things that I really, really like in this deck, but at 7 mana is just a little bit too much, and I think that's really what pushes it out. It could be good, but it's just going to be too slow in most games, especially if I'm spending 7 mana to return permanents from graveyard to hand. Then I've got to wait a turn before I can play them. If I'm proliferating, that could be very good, but if I've got enough counters on to be worth proliferating, then I've probably already got a good board presence. Gaining life in that situation is going to be a pretty drastic emergency measure. May work out well in conjunction with some of the other things, but overall, at 7 mana, it's just a little bit too late in the game for my game plan. Right, and that, I believe, covers everything in this deck for now. So, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative with my decisions and why I decided to put in what I did. And if you fancy giving it a go ahead. It's a free world, for the most part. Now, I'm not sure whether or not I'm going to do... Well, I'm definitely going to do a few more Magic the Gathering videos, for certain. Because I've got some decks that I do really want to show off. And they have a little bit of a... Well, the one main one I want to show off is not necessarily a unique concept, but isn't something that I've seen being done in this standard environment so far. So I definitely want to do that. However, I can't say in the long run whether I'm going to do more of these videos, whether I'm going to make frequent Magic content, or whether I'm more or less using this as a jumping board, as something that I enjoy enough to sit down and record, and something that's able to be casually handled enough to give me an entry board back into making videos more frequently. But I guess we'll see. If you enjoyed the videos, then please let me know in the comments so I can actually make a bit of a more educated decision on whether I continue to do this. But overall, I had fun. I hope you enjoyed the deck, and I'll see you next time.